Hey, Shalom, Shabbatah, Pura Vida. So we're just continuing from part 18. So if you have not watched, part 18, please make sure, to watch that first before you watch this, you know, because, so we're starting to see, the development of chattel slavery, or how indentured service or terms of service were being extended to life, to life terms, basically, becoming slavery. This was happening to your ancestors, the so-called Negro, the American Indians, all right? Not Africans. All right, so let's continue where we left off on part 18. And again, thanks for being here.
And so there are two sources of labor in colonial Virginia, the first of these being indentured servants. These were poor Europeans who agreed to a fixed term of forced labor in return for their passage across the Atlantic. Now, why are they called indentured servants? Good question. That is because an indenture was a type of contract. Both sides get a copy. It's got a jagged edge that looks like somebody bit it, rather than cut it with scissors or something like that. So you cut it along this jagged edge, and you know that the contract's real when the two identical parts are put together with the identical indenture. And in a lot of cases, there would actually be 3 copies of the contract, and one would be kept at the courthouse. So that's why it's called an indenture, because it's a type of contract between two individuals or groups. Now, the other part of Virginia's labor force would have been African slaves. Now, this is something that was gradual. At the very beginning, there were more indentured servants than African slaves. In fact, at the very beginning, there were 0 African slaves.
All right, so real quick, just want to say let's dodge the hijack with the African, but shout out to Tom Ritchie for this history lesson. And again, as he was saying, it was indentured servants. All right, in the beginning, there was no African slaves at all. There was no slaves. It was all indentured servants. Remember, the Virginia Act that legalized, gave it a statute. Slavery was in 1661. So when the first so-called Africans, he's gonna talk about, he's gonna say Africans again. Let's dodge your own hijack, right? We know these are American Indians, right? We've been showing this in this whole series, all right? We talked about in the last video, they were coming from West Indies. They were pirated off a Spanish ship, all right? Spanish were enslaving American Indians in their encomienda system all throughout their colonies. All right, he's gonna mention this, all right? So also very important what he mentioned is how it was a gradual slavery. He said gradual process, gradual. There was a development. Remember, it went from indenture, servitude, service, terms of service, contracts, into chattel slavery. It developed. There was a process, right? All right, so let's continue with Tom Ritchie.
And slavery kind of gradually became institutionalized in colonial Virginia until finally it was decided that slaves were the property of their masters for life. But it wasn't until 1619 that 20 African slaves arrived in Virginia, and it really was kind of, all right, well, what do we do with them? Because at first, slaves were actually treated like indentured servants. And, this is something that probably goes beyond a survey level course, but one day I may do a lecture about what, is about the evolution of slavery as an institution in Virginia in the 17th century. But in 1619, the first slaves arrived. Now, by 1670, you see this piece of art here that shows us all of these slaves working here in Virginia, cultivating tobacco, it looks like. And by this time, by the last quarter of the 17th century, African slaves had become the dominant labor force in Virginia. Before that, it was not the case. Indentured servitude was much more common.
All right, so we're still in the book Indian Slavery in Colonial Times within the present limits of the United States. And it says here, with the growth of the idea of property incident to the slavery status, the early transition of the slave from personal estate to a chattel real or real estate with accompanying incidents was easy and natural. Under the caption of property, both Negro and Indian slaves were subject to taxation like other property, either for colonial revenue in general
or to meet the local expenses. Moreover, in certain colonies, both Indian and Negro slaves were assigned the double character of persons subject to a poll tax and property subject to a property tax. All right, you hear that? South Carolina, in the Act of 1690, provided that all slaves, as to the payment of debts, shall be deemed and taken as all other goods and chattels, and all Negroes and slaves shall be accounted as freehold in all other cases whatsoever, and descend accordingly. Middleton, president of the council, consequently declared in 1725 that Negroes were real property, such as houses and lands in Carolina. Yet they were always returned as personal property in the inventories of interstates. This condition continued until 1740, when it was declared that Negroes and Indian slaves shall be reputed and adjudged in law to be chattels personal in the hands of their owners and possessors and their executors, administers, and assigns. Various tax acts were passed from time to time for special reasons, and in some of these Indian slaves, along with Negroes, were a part of the basis of taxation, being rated as property without specification as to real or personal, along with goods, lands, cattle, and white servants. Such an act was passed in 1703. The act contained the general term slaves, which of course included Indian slaves by implication, all right? A tax on polls was generally selected by the colonies as the chief source of revenue. In accordance with this idea of taxation, North Carolina during the 18th century regarded Indian slaves as taxables. In the earliest legislative action of the colony, taxables were declared to be every white male aged 16 years and every slave, Negro, mulatto, or Indian male or female aged 12 years. By the Act of 1750, furthermore, a taxable was every white man of 16 years of age, every Negro, mulatto, or mustee, and every other person of mixed blood to the fourth generation, 12 years of age. In 1682, the gradual process of change from the status of Indian servitude to that of Indian slavery was completed. The Virginia Act of 1670 had declared a condition of slavery for all Indians imported into the colony by sea, but the great body of subject Indians were natives of the country. Such Indians remained servants up to 1676, when at the beginning of the Indian War, one of the Bacon's laws made all Indian captives slaves. In 1682, slavery was extended to captives sold by tributary Indians, in the hope of mitigating their condition, as it was certain that they would be held in slavery by their captors. These acts did not make provision for changing the condition of Indian servants that existed in the colony before 1670. Such a change had come about through a gradual and natural process, with the passage of the laws mentioned and the changed attitude towards the subject Indians, so that in fact all subject Indians were not considered slaves. Hence, in 1682, all Indian slaves were considered in law as persons inasmuch as they were titables, or like taxable. By 1705, it was found necessary for legal purposes to advance the property notion of the slave from personality to realty. Though certain incidents of the personality were still retained, the statute of that year by which the change was effected provided that in the future all Negro, mulatto, or Indian slaves in all courts of jurisdiction and other places within this dominion shall be held, taken, and adjudged to be real estate and not chattels. As a part of the real estate property, slaves were subject to taxation. An act of 1748 again made slaves personal estate, but was repealed by the king, October 31st, 1751. By the act of 1779 and 1781, slaves were still liable to a poll tax of £5 and £10, respectively, to be paid by the owner. So it may be seen that from 1649 until after the Revolution, Indian servants and slaves, either as persons or as property, were used as a basis for taxation in Virginia. Judicial cases concerning American slavery and the Negro, edited by Helen Tunnicliffe Catterall. Volume 1. There's 5 volumes. This is volume 1. And these are from the cases from the courts of England, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. All right. Washington, D.C., published by the Carnegie Institution of Washington, 1926. All right. So remember, these first 69 were indentured servants. These were indentured servants. I guess, again, I'll read that part. So they all of a sudden, from supposedly slaves, because the Spanish didn't have slaves either, they had encomiendas, which was just like an indentured servitude system. Encomienda, that they put the American Indians in. All right. So it says that it became servitude analogous to that of the indentured white servants. These first 20 so-called Negroes that came to Comfort Point in Virginia, not Jamestown, in Comfort Point, were indentured servants. But why this step upward? Why did not the status of slave persist? The most convincing answer, and one which the few known facts support, is that some or all of these Negroes had been baptized by the Spaniards, and by the law of England which governed Virginia, a slave who had been Christianized or baptized became enfranchised. We have only the scant testimony of their names. Of the original 20 Negroes brought in 1619, we know perhaps the names of 11. One of them a Negro woman, owned by John Rolfe's father-in-law, not Powhatan but Captain William Pierce, father of his third wife, was called Angelo, a name uncommon in England and unknown in Africa. Unknown in Africa! It's not an African! Others were Anthony and Isabella, whose master was Captain William Tucker of Elizabeth City. Their child William is not listed in the census of 1623, as he was probably not yet born, but he appears in Captain Tucker's muster in 1625. It is significant that his baptism is recorded, and is that of another William, an Indian. You hear this? Listen, an Indian owned by Captain Tucker, while no mention is made of the baptism of Anthony and Isabella. This is undoubtedly because they had already been baptized under Spanish auspices, as their names indicate, for it was and it is a rule of Christianity to administer the rite but once to each neophyte. There were also two other Anthonys, two Johns and William, Francis, Edward, and Margaret, whose names may or may not have been anglicizations of Antonio, Juan, Guilin, Francisca, Eduardo, and Margarita. Alright, so continuing in the book, judicial cases concerning American slavery and the Negro, and how they were talking about how they were baptized and they were get to be free if they do their term of service, right? So they become servants as long as they chose to be baptized Christian. So regarding that, right, just wanted to show you how significant is that, right? Because who would they really baptize? If we remember, right, the Spanish were calling the Indians infidels and savages and trying to baptize them, not trying, what did baptize them and basically enforce their religion on them, the Christianity, on Indians, right? The early theory that the enslavement of infidels was justifiable in order to make Christians of them had for a corollary that when the purpose of enslavement had been achieved by their conversion, their slavery ceased and they became free. Alright? This corollary had become difficult of application. If freedom was a reward of baptism, could any slave resist it, no matter how rudimentary his theology? Or could many masters welcome it? And even if slaves had not been baptized, they could easily pretend to have been, a danger recognized by the Maryland legislators in 1664. It became expedient to require a more visible and more permanent sign than the water of baptism to differentiate the slave from the free. All right, so they needed something else because they couldn't tell who was baptized and who wasn't. It wasn't that easy. Right? They wanted an easier way to basically be able to call you, well, that's a servant or so-called slave. That's an automatic slave right there, right? So this is what they're trying to get at. And a cutis was put on baptism as a method of emancipation by statutes in the various colonies. The Virginia Act was passed in 1667. And says, whereas some doubts have arisen whether children that are slaves by birth and by the charity and piety of their owners made partakers of the blessed sacrament of baptism should by virtue of their baptism be made free, it is enacted that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom, that diverse masters freed from this doubt may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by permitting children, those slaves, or those of greater growth, if capable, to be admitted to that sacrament. Thenceforth, baptism ceased to be the test of freedom, and color became the sign of slavery again. So they stopped the baptism as the sign of freedom, and color, your skin color, became the sign of slavery. Black, or graduated shades thereof. Black, so-called black, or graduated shades, all the shades, copper-colored tribes of America. A Negro was presumed to be a slave.
All right, again, we're in the book A History of Slavery in Virginia. This is written by the Johns Hopkins University. All right, and we're going to go and continue where we left off in the other video, part 18. We're going to continue in that part. It's talking about after the so-called 20 odd Negroes arrived in Virginia and how very little importation of other so-called Negroes were arriving in the years following. All right, so here we go.
Continuing in the book, in the next 4 years, there seems to have been little importation of Negroes into Virginia or the Bermudas. Again, in the next 4 years, there seems to have been little importation of Negroes into either Virginia or the Bermudas. But we've already read that in these times, who was getting enslaved massively and becoming servants, prisoners of war, right? The Indians, right? They didn't need so-called importation at that time. English trading ships on their way from the West Indies brought these no doubt more by accident than by design. Thus the James in 1621, the Margaret and John in 1622, and the Swan in 1623 each brought a single Negro into Virginia. A single Negro. Where's the millions? In 1625, more than 5 years after the first introduction of Negroes into Virginia, when the white population was about 2,500, there were but 23 Negroes in the colony, the same number as in 1623, one child having been born and one Negro having died. So for more than 2 years, no importation seems to have been made. Importation remained of this occasional nature well through the first half of the 17th century. They weren't importing. Remember that. We already got this before. 30 years after the first introduction of Negroes, only 300 were to be found in Virginia, a number of whom were no doubt the result of natural increase. But by 1659, the value of Negro labor, even amongst the preponderating white servants, was beginning to be realized, and the Assembly legislated in favor of its importation. The allowance of a head right for the Negro after 1635, as for any other immigrant, and the scarcity of labor in the rapid colonial expansion account for the rise of the new demand. Some Virginia planters obtained large estates through head rights for imported Negroes and white servants too. These facts also help to explain the enslavement of the Negro, which followed in 1661. Remember, this included American Indians, this act, and the formation by Englishmen of a third and exclusive company for the slave trade in 1662. It is to the operations of this company and to individual English traders that Virginia was indebted for the most of her slaves. From 1664 to 1671, several shiploads of Negroes were brought in, but servants continued to be imported at the greater rate of 1,500 a year. Servants. A year in 1671, there were 6,000 servants to 2,000 slaves in Virginia. By 1683, the number of servants had doubled, while that of the slaves had increased by only 1/3. From this time forth, servitude gave way before slavery. Again, from this time forth, servitude gave way before slavery. Alright, servitude. Indentured servitude, which was forced on the colony in the large importation of Negroes by the Royal African Company under its exclusive charter. It was the policy of the King and of the Duke of York. We're talking about King James here, the Duke of York, who stood at the head of the company King James, who stood at the head of the company. We're talking about the Royal African Company, to hasten the adoption of slavery by enactments cutting off the supply of indented servants at the same time that large importations of slaves were made by their agents. The laws in 1676 and 1682, which legalized Indian slavery, cooperated still further to increase the slave population. It legalized what? Indian slavery. All right, back in the book, Judicial Cases Concerning American Slavery and the Negro. And it says here, however, the colonists did not depend on traffic or kidnapping for their supply of Indian slaves, but took the enemy pagan by their own prowess in war, and enslaved him long before the passage of the Virginia Acts of 1676 and 1679. When forces were being raised in Maryland in 1652 for a march against the Eastern Shore Indians, such Indian prisoners as shall happen to be taken are declared to the spoil of those who financed the expedition. Indians were also reduced to slavery and punishment for crime. Thus, we have shown that the first slaves in the colony of Virginia, all right, listen, the first slaves or servants, indentured servitude, right, in the colony of Virginia were Indians, not Negroes, so-called Negroes, Indians, and that the laws of the colony sanctioned Indian slavery except as regard prospective importations by land. For a few years after the passage of the Act of 1670, the practice of the colonists in accordance with their laws is illustrated by cases in the courts of Virginia and Maryland. From 1627 to 1831 and 1627, some Indians of the Carib Islands were brought into the country, Virginia, in 1627 by Captain Sampson, but the experiment was too disastrous to warrant repetition, at least on a wholesale scale. Alright, Carib Indians. That Indians were brought in and held in slavery for many years subsequent to 1682 is indicated by the evidence of witnesses and the assertions of counsel in cases brought forth 90 to 150 years later, and by acts passed in the 18th century. Robin and others who brought actions in 1772 to try their titles to freedom were descendants of Indian women brought into this country by traders at several times between the years 1682 and 1748, and by them sold as slaves under the Act of Assembly made in 1682. Mason, counsel for the plaintiffs, asserts that hundreds of the descendants of Indians, brought in between 1682 and 1684 have obtained their freedom on actions brought in this court. In the case of Henry in June 1772, the court gave judgment against many descendants of Indians introduced and held as slaves between 1682 and 1705. That many Indians were reduced to slavery between 1691 and 1705 is shown by Henning's assertion that thousands of their descendants were deprived of their liberty when they sued for it later on. In the revisal of the laws in 1705, an act concerning servants and slaves reenacts Chapter 1 of the Act of 1682 in substance but omits the word Indian. Alright, so now they omit the Indian, right? They're about to change you. Alright, and the special clauses respecting Indian slaves. The facts disclosed in these cases show that Indians continued to be brought in as slaves during the early part of the 18th century, and an Act of Assembly 1723 indicates that the legislature of that time did not consider that Indian slavery was extinguished by the Act of 1705. It was enacted that no Negro, mulatto, or Indian slaves shall be set free. See how they group them together? Except for some meritorious services. Now listen to this. As the child of an Indian was deemed a mulatto, so the child of an Indian was deemed mulatto automatically. As the child of an Indian was deemed mulatto, don't you have mulatto in your ancestors' census records? As the child of an Indian was deemed a mulatto, they would have been before 1705 if that act forbade enslavement of Indians thereafter. The actual practice, as shown by the cases which came before the courts, proved that the Act of 1705 was not regarded as the palladium of Indian liberty till some 65 or 75 years after its passage. It must, of course, be kept in mind that the Indian ancestresses on whom the suits for freedom were based in all these cases had been theoretically and perhaps actually members of hostile tribes. The friendly Indian was on an altogether different plane. Alright, the colonists made his temporal and spiritual welfare the subject of their paternalistic legislation and beneficence the Friends pagans, as they were called in Maryland, in this distinction from enemy pagans, might come to the colonists as hostages in exchange for the English hostages, might be employed as servants, the male Indians being particularly useful in eking out the food supply by the hunting and fishing, or might be brought in as children by their parents to be instructed in the Christian religion. Alright, so these good friend pagans, as they call them, the good Indians to them, because they did treaties with them. So the bad Indians, right, the enemy pagans, the so-called Negro, right, which they call in mulatto, Negro, colored, right? All right, now just a footnote. All right, talking about regarding what we were just talking about or reading. It says here 112, in the early colonial days, hostile Indians were all who were not friendly. By 1682, the friendly Indians are called neighboring Indians, confederates, or tributaries. The distance of the hostile Indians from the settlement is an important element of his hostility. His foreign quality is emphasized, and he is definitely located outside the North American continent by the court in Coleman versus Pat in 1793, which held that though no American Indian could be reduced to slavery since the Act of 1705, foreign Indians, listen to this, foreign Indians, we're not talking about Africans, or now they're not calling them Negroes, right? Foreign Indians coming within the description of that act might be made slaves, but the foreign ones, we can enslave them. Let's enslave them, let's call them Negroes. But the term is used in the Act of 1705, Chapter 52, Section 2, to designate non-tributary American Indians who are approachable by land, for the tributary Indians are required to march with the English in pursuit of foreign Indians. You hear that? I wasn't looking, I wasn't going to read this, but look at this. 113, infidel was the general term for Indian in Virginia. Who were they calling infidels? Indians. Who were they baptizing? Infidels, right? Indians. So these people they were bringing up, remember, Antonio, Maria, Eduardo, Pedro, right? These were Indians. They had baptized, given Christian names. Judicial cases concerning American slavery and the Negro. It says here in March 1662, it is enacted that what Englishman trader or others shall bring in any Indians as servants, and shall assign them over to any other, shall not sell them as slaves, nor for any longer time than English of the like ages shall serve by the Act of Assembly. This Act of 1662 definitely fixes the status of Indians brought in as servants. They are to be no worse off than the indentured English servants, alright? The same as, the English servants, right? Talking about you, right? So-called Negro, Indian, right? They are to be no worse of the like ages. The class of Indian servants received an ascension to their ranks by the Act of 1670, which provided that Indian captives sold to the English by the nation that taketh them should also be servants for a term, though a much longer term than the Indian servants from friendly tribes. Though the Acts of 1676, 1679, and 1682 co-signed such captives thereafter to slavery, the supply of servants of Indian blood was continued in a steady stream by Acts of 1691 and of 1723. By the former, the bastard child of a white mother and an Indian father is to be bound out as a servant until he shall attain the age of 30 years. By the latter, the bastard child of a white woman and an Indian or a Negro or mulatto, listen to this, an Indian, parentheses, or a Negro or mulatto, same thing, right? That's what we're talking about. They're letting you know. Had not only to pay for the sins of its parents by serving 30 years, but the sins were visited on the next generation, where any female mulatto or Indian, same thing, by law obliged to serve till the age of 30 or 31 years, shall during the time of her servitude have any child born of her body, every child shall serve the master of such Indian, mulatto or Indian, until it shall attain the same age the mother of such child was obliged by law to serve unto.
Yes. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why did slavery replace indentured servitude as the primary labor force? Well, once indentured servants finished their term of indenture, they would get land and they would move out into the countryside. This land typically wasn't as good as the tidewater land closer to the coast. And also, this land was more remote, it was more vulnerable to Indian attacks and things of that nature. And so in 1676, what we see is Bacon's Rebellion, which was a revolt of frontier settlers versus tidewater planters, the planters being these very wealthy landowners. And what you see happening here is that these indentured servants, after they're done working, they form, a potential angry mob. And there were also black men who participated in Bacon's Rebellion. And slavery as a labor force was found more convenient by these planters because the slaves don't move out onto the frontier and become independent and rowdy when their term of indenture is done. Instead, they stay on the plantation, their children are property, so on and so forth.
The illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. Again, the illegal beginning of American Negro slavery. England's first slaver, an instant hero, it says. The allure of the vast Spanish undertaking in the New World, with its attendant wealth and sea power, and African slaving was not lost on Elizabethan England. Now dodge the hijack, right? African slaving. In 1562, John Hawkins, right? Very important, research John Hawkins, cousin of Sir Francis Drake, another person, research him, conceived the idea of selling slaves to Spanish colonists, despite the Spanish embargo on trade with non-Spaniards. Hawkins picked up a cargo of Negroes of the African coast and successfully peddled them in Spanish America, thereby becoming England's first slaver. For this feat, Captain Hawkins became an instant hero at home. So you see how he became a hero.
So just a quick reminder, we've already broke this down in past videos already about John Hawkins and Francis Drake and Hawkins' journey, right? His slave boy's journey. How he actually got most of these so-called Negroes really in Cape Verde, what they say on the coast of Guinea or the Guinea coast, right? They're talking about the coast of West Africa, which is where Cape Verde is, and they got a lot of so-called Negroes from there. So if we remember, right, a lot of the Spanish, Portuguese were sending Indians over to Cape Verde, right? As it says here, right, and as my teacher told me, the Portuguese began to depopulate Labrador, transporting the now extinct Botoc Indians to Europe and Cape Verde as slaves. All right, we got accounts of Columbus and Spanish doing that as well. Alright, so let's dodge the hijack, alright, because, this happened way before 1562. The Spanish and Portuguese were enslaving Indians, transporting them, shipping them over to Cape Verde, way before John Hawkins got there in 1562. So who was he really taking? Because we know American Indians are the so-called Negro. Alright, put two and two together. As Jack Forbes told us in his book Africans and Native Americans, the fact of a relatively small but steady American presence in Africa from at least the early 1500s, meaning even before that, 1490s, right, onward, may well prove to be a vital area for future research. That's what we're doing right now. We are in the future, since one would expect to find Native American cultural influences in regions such as Angola, Zaire, and Ghana. Really? There's a lot of Cape Verdeans in Angola. So, talking about Indians. Guinea, right at the coast of Guinea, Cape Verde, especially in Cape Verde, you're gonna find Native American cultural influence. Why is that? Why is that? All right, check Jack Forbes sources. They're all legit. All right, let's continue.
Says Drake, his cousin, and the other Sea Dogs soon followed Hawkins into the exciting and profitable game of piracy on the Spanish Main, and English slaving became merely one aspect of English piracy. So you see how English slaving started. It was basically piracy. They weren't taking them from African land, they were taking them from the Spanish and Portuguese ships. Alright? They told us when we were little that these English ships were coming straight from Africa. And it probably still says that on the textbooks right now. Negroes were considered simply one form of booty to be taken from the opulent Spanish. Nevertheless, those first black arrivals at Jamestown were not enslaved immediately. Rather, they were assimilated into that singular institution known as indentured servitude for a term of years, improvised by the Virginia Company from the child labor laws of Elizabethan England. Again, so these first 20 so-called Negroes didn't just come in chains straight from Africa and served like the slaves that they show us in movies. They were basically, as they say here, indentured servants into indentured servitude. And again, this was a copy, again, it says here, from the child labor laws of the Elizabethan England. Now it says the Elizabethan period was hard on the poor in England. With idlers everywhere, it was generally thought that the cure-all for poverty was work, forced labor if necessary. In this situation, in 1562, 45 years before the founding of Jamestown, Parliament borrowed from the guild system in London, where it was customary for youngsters to be apprenticed to a craftsman to learn a trade under an indenture between the craftsman and the parents for a term of years. The Statute of Apprentices, 1562, declared in part, every householder exercising any occupation may retain the son of any freeman not occupying husbandry, nor being a laborer, to be bound as an apprentice for 7 years at the least, so as the term do not expire afore such apprentice shall be. So you hear what they're saying, right? They're saying that they used to grab the kids in England from the poor families, and they made them work for 7 years. They made them work, forced labor. This was indentured servitude. And this is where they got the whole indentured servitude in the Americas, aka slavery. Now continuing, it says, this statute surely acclimated Englishmen to the concept of bondage servitude, but it failed in the purposes, for the unemployment problem remained, and by the 1590s famine crippled England. At length, Parliament passed the Poor Laws, intended to end the wanderings of the poor. The Act of 1601 declared the church wardens of every parish shall be overseers of the poor, and shall take order for setting to work the children of all whose parents shall not be thought able to keep their children, and for putting out such children to be apprentices. Other sections authorize the putting to work of unemployed adults for terms of years. So by 1606, when James I, right, King James, chartered the Virginia Company to plant a colony on North America, the idea of forced labor and bondage servitude was an accepted national policy of Stuart England. So again, they say they outlawed slavery, but they actually had a policy in England, right, which was bondage servitude, right? And so that's how they played it. That's how they were slick about it. That's how they played it. So let's continue. From 1607 to 1618, the company in London labored to recruit venturesome souls to ship over, but the Jamestown foothold remained tenuous. In 1618, the impoverished company finally hit on a simple method to assure a growing volume of new colonists, privately indentured servants. Under this arrangement, a planter in Virginia would guarantee payment of passage of a new colonist. The recruit would sign an indenture in London, becoming on arrival at Jamestown the indentured servant of the planter for a specific term such as 7 years. The concept of indentured servants in Virginia and the other colonies was thus borrowed from the English poor laws. So again, they're saying that these first colonists, they had to make a deal. So if they wanted to come to the New World, right, the so-called New World, they had to go into this indentured servitude for a number of years. That was their contract, 7 years, I guess. And after that, it would be free. All right. So it says soon the method was simplified further. An enterprising captain or ship owner would himself enlist recruits at London. On arrival at Jamestown, the recruits would be auctioned off to the highest bidder for a specified term by the captain at dockside. So what are they telling us here? White people or Europeans were slaves or indentured servants too. Obviously, they didn't get to the scope of the so-called Negro, right, the Indians, but they were also auctioned off, it says here. This rapidly became the common method of immigration. The rule soon arose in Jamestown and other colonial ports that any person without fare on arrival would simply be auctioned at dockside into indentured servitude. This system, which was practical and economical and legal by custom and usage, was probably considered fair by all concerned given the precedents for indentured labor in England. Alright, so let's continue. It says here, such was the situation when the first 20 Negroes arrived in 1619 as part of a prize taken by piracy from a Spanish ship in the Indies. They were simply indentured for their passage. Again, these first Negroes, right, so-called Negroes, that ones that they tell us were the first African slaves brought to America, and when slavery first started, 1619, they were actually taken by piracy from a Spanish ship in the Indies or the Caribbean. And I told you they were coming from Veracruz, so they were probably Mexican, Aztec, or Mayas. They were simply indentured for their passage, okay? So they had to basically, since they made it to America and they were brought there by these English people, they had to basically join the other colonies that were coming in and basically serve indentured servitude. The proceeds of the auction went to the owners of the pirate ship. Had future arrivals continued on a casual basis, they might all have been absorbed as indentured servants and ultimately have become free Americans. Okay, you hearing that? They would have became free Americans after they served their term. And this was in 1619 when they first got there. So do the math, 7 years later. Okay.
Alright, again, we're in the book A History of Slavery in Virginia. This is written by the Johns Hopkins University.
All right, so this is chapter 2 in this book, and it's called Development of Slavery. All right, the development of slavery. Legal status of the slave. The creation of legal status is dependent locally upon either customary or statutory law, and in the case of organized society, usually upon both. It is the result of development rather than of a single specific act, so it happened over time. Didn't just say, oh, we're going to put this law into place and this is what's going to happen. He's trying to say it just kind of happened. It is the result of development rather than of a single specific act. Though such an act culminating from a previous development may serve to distinguish sharply the legal condition of one individual from that of another, and so mark the progression from one status to another, Status embraces one or more incidents, essential to a strict definition, which rests for authority, ultimately on custom recognized as law, through either judicial decisions or statutory enactments. These incidents may be combined with others, non-essential, which derived from the same source, vary in number, kind, and degree according to the nature of the status fixed, and which are constantly increased and modified as this status approaches its full legal perfection. So a lot of jargon here in legalese, but you see what they're trying to say. It just kind of develops the whole slaves, like the word slave and the status, how it became, how you eventually was called slave or became chattel slave. All right. The addition of modification of some essential incident, however, may at any time involve such important consequences and differences in legal relations as to justify the creation in terms of law of a new status marking the rise of a new institution, which historically is but a part of a previous institutional growth. Alright, they're talking about the institution of slavery, how it's a part of a previous, it was part of something, it was something else before it became an institution of slavery. It was previous, as part of a previous institutional growth. This, as will be pointed out, finds illustration in the closely related institutions of servitude and slavery. Servitude and slavery, each with its clear marked status in law and custom. In the case of societies politically dependent as colonies generally are, the status of individuals not predetermined by the common or customary law or statute law of the governing community or by private international law may be fixed as to its characteristic element by single acts of the judiciary or legislature of the sovereign or even of the dependent body. In these acts, either the force of previous custom in the community is recognized or legality is given to the legislation of some other political entity through the adoption of a status determined by it. Both of these methods receive illustration in the imposition of a status by the English and Dutch upon the Negroes imported into their American colonies, the Negroes, all right, not Africans, Negroes, general term. The distinguishing mark of the state of slavery is not the loss of liberty, political and civil, but the perpetuity and almost absolute character of that loss, whether voluntary or involuntary in origin. It differs then from other forms of servitude, limited in place or time, such as medieval vassalage, villainage, modern serfdom, and technical servitude in degree rather than in kind. Its other incidents being very similar and in many cases even identical with theirs. In the civil right of personal freedom, the slave alone has no part, but in other social rights such as personal security and the right to private property, the slave might, and in almost all historic cases did, participate to a limited extent together with the vassal, villain, serf, and servant. The first Negroes introduced into North American colonies, that is, those early brought to the Bermudas and to Virginia, listen to this, and to Virginia. So we read 1616 in Bermuda, and Virginia 1619, right? Suppose they do not seem to have been slaves, all right? They weren't slaves in the strict sense of the term. These were not slaves. These were not African slaves, as they've been telling us in our history class. In 1619, the first so-called African slaves arrived. That's false history, wrong, because it does not seem to have been slaves that were brought into these places in the strict sense of the term, as the captives not of warfare but of piracy. They were under the protection of international law in maintaining their original status, and had they been citizens of a powerful civilized community, they might have received it. They were no doubt slaves or captives of the Spanish, but no rights of ownership, even if just could pass to the nation by whom they were made a price of piracy. The masters, the Dutch and English privateers, right? Privateers, pirates, therefore had no rights of ownership which they could legally exercise or transfer over the Negroes imported until rights were recognized by the law of England or of the Bermudas and Virginia. Until this recognition came, the Negroes were persons of undetermined status, to whom the privileges of the common law were not specifically extended. If the term slavery can be used at all to describe their condition, it is only in the sense of political, as distinguished from domestic slavery, that is, dependence upon the state similar to the plebeian at Rome and the helot of Sparta, a condition from which the majority of the Virginians had, as a matter of fact, though not of law, just emerged in 1619, and in which the people of the Bermudas still, to a certain extent, remained. Domestic slavery could find no sanction until the absolute ownership in the bodies of the Negroes was vested by lawful authority in some individual. The first step in this direction was not made until 1623 in the Bermuda Islands, and it was not until 1625 that a case involving similar actions arose in Virginia. In both instances, the question settled was that of ownership of the right to the services of the Negroes, not of their persons. All right, so they're talking about, all right, the ownership of their the services they were providing, like if they were farmers, whatever, painters, construction workers, whatever, their service, not their bodies, not their persons. In the Bermudas, it was vested in individuals and has the appearance of a full recognition of private ownership in this right. In Virginia, the right was vested in an individual, but under peculiar circumstances, and as the individual was the governor of the colony, it probably involved nothing more than legal recognition of public ownership, which custom and official action had previously sanctioned in the case of former Negroes. In each case, the legal right conferred was that of possessio and not of dominium. And in the absence of specification to the contrary, it was of limited duration and consequently lacked the most essential elements of a state of slavery. The subsequent action of the possessor shows that the legal limitations were recognized and observed. All right, it wasn't slavery, is what they're trying to tell you in the strictest sense of the term, like they said earlier. Whatever may have been the intent and hope of the persons in possession of the Negroes as regard their ultimate enslavement, all right, so whatever they were thinking or plotting on, though, it wasn't legal yet. No attempt to do so legally seems for a long time to have been made. Like I just said, no attempt to do so legally seems for a long time to have been made, though the practice and incidents of Negro and Indian slavery in the Spanish colonies, same people, were perfectly familiar to the people of Virginia. For some reason, the notion of enslavement gained ground but slowly, and although the conditions surrounding a Negro or Indian in possession could easily make him a de facto slave, so even though because of the way they were treating them and living, you know, you can basically consider them slaves, but the colonist seems to have preferred to retain him only as a servant. The colonist seems to have preferred to retain him only as a servant, not a slave. This was largely the result of the developing institution of servitude. The institution of servitude indentured servants, which in the early years of the 17th century adequately met the economic demands of colonial society, and for social and moral reasons was preferable to any system of slavery, and particularly to that of Negroes and Indians, again, and particularly to that of Negroes and Indians. All right, it was preferred more indentured servitude for moral reasons to any systems of slavery, and particularly to that of Negroes and Indians, same people, especially applying to you, so-called Negro American Indian. The primary steps in the institutional development which culminated in slavery are then to be found in the legislation, customary and statutory, that defined that condition of persons legally known as servitude. All right, they're telling you right now, right? John Hopkins University book, right? Political Science and History. The primary steps in the institutional development which culminated in slavery, all right, what basically created slavery, are then to be found in the legislation. You can find it in the legislation, in the customary and statutory, and all these laws, all these codes that define that conditions of persons legally known as servitude or servants, indentured servants. This is how it began. Servitude not only preceded slavery, It preceded slavery in the logical development of the principle of subjection, standing midway between freedom and absolute subjection. We already got this in the other book, right? Between. So you were in between. So they were playing games basically. They knew this. They can stretch it either way, anytime they wanted to. Either they can put you in absolute subjection at some point or let you go free. So you would, being a servant didn't seem so bad, I guess, at some time, even for white people coming over here as indentured servants, crossing the Atlantic and having to work 7 years. Didn't seem so bad for them. Most of them eventually did their 7 years and their time, and they got their freedom. But what happened to the so-called Negro and Indians? Right? You're in between this midway of freedom and absolute subjection. So what happened to you? Absolute subjection. But it was the historic base upon which slavery, by the extension and addition of incidents, was constructed. All right? It was constructed. Slavery was constructed based off indentured servitude, developed itself from a species of free contract labor, contract, by the peculiar conditions surrounding the importation of settlers and laborers into the English American colonies. Servitude was first applied to whites and then to Negroes and Indians. All right, so whites were there too. Whites. It began to receive legal definition as soon as colonial law became operative in 1619, at the very time that the first importation of Negroes were made. At the same time, the so-called first African so-called slaves arrived. The so-called Africans, right, were American Indians. This began at the same time. It was but natural then that they should be absorbed in a growing system which spread to all the colonies, and for nearly a century furnished the chief supply of colonial labor. Negro and Indian servitude thus preceded Negro and Indian slavery, and together with white servitude and instances continued even after the institution of slavery was fully developed. All right, yo, I'm gonna read that one more time, that last part right there. Let's get this clear. All right, you're watching this right now. All right, it was but natural then that they should be absorbed. So these first so-called African slave, right, that they tell us in history class, and they keep telling us when we keep researching about it in Google, right? They throw in the African. When we were little kids, they told us straight up. They lied to us like straight up. They said that this was a Dutch ship, like Dutch people coming from West Africa directly. That's the story they told us growing up. And now we're seeing, right, that they were actually coming from the West Indies. They were pirated from Spanish ships off the coast of Veracruz in Mexico, in the Caribbean, Mexico. All right, these were American Indians they brought in. They called so-called 20-odd Negroes. 20-odd Negroes. Because they didn't look like the Negroes that they saw there. So they were odd to them. These were odd Negroes. You gotta understand the wording. It doesn't say nothing about African. All right, so it was natural when these so-called 20-odd Negroes arrived in Virginia that they'd be absorbed in the growing system which spread to all the colonies. They're talking about the indentured servitude, and for nearly a century furnished. All right, this is what furnished the plantations. All those so-called slaves, they were indentured servants first. This was chiefly supply of the colonial labor. This was the chief supply of the colonial labor, indentured servitude, these plantations in the South. Negro and Indian servitude. Negro and Indian. See how they always put it together? It's the same people. Thus proceeded Negro and Indian slavery. It was before the chattel slavery they created after. And together with white servitude. So there was white servants working along in the plantations with your ancestors. And instances continued even after institution of slavery was fully developed. Virginia was not the only colony in which servitude bore this direct relation to slavery as its preparatory stage or form. Negro and Indian servitude passed historically into slavery in most of the English American colonies, if not in all. Okay? You Ados, you're a descendant of a slave. No, you're not. You're a POW. You're a prisoner of war. You're a descendant of American Indians. You were great. You were free. You roamed the land. All right? You're not a product of slavery. Slavery happened to you eventually, but you're not part of it. You're not synonymous with that word, as they've been telling you. And why would you want to tag yourself with that? Calling yourself a descendant of a slave when you were great. You were great people. Again, Virginia was not the only colony in which servitude bore this direct relation to slavery in its preparatory stage or form. Negro and Indian servitude passed historically into slavery. All right, Negro and Indian servitude passed historically into slavery in most of the English American colonies, if not in all right, in all of them, in all the 13 colonies. This is certainly true of Maryland, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. In all these colonies, statutory recognition of slavery, though tending to be anticipated by customary or judicial sanction, was postponed for something after the introduction of the subjects of slavery, who were consequently referred to a different status. Most of the incidents developed in servitude were passed on to slavery. Again, most of the incidents developed in servitude were passed on to slavery, some of them modified and amplified to conform to the changed relations. But the numerous acts on the statute books applying equally to servants and slaves show that similarity and very essential connection of the two institutions continued while they existed side by side. The period of the chief legal development of servitude was naturally prior to the recognition of slavery. Naturally prior to the recognition of slavery. But even after the transition to slavery, so there was a transition. Look what they're telling you. Look what we're reading here, right? This is not my opinions. All right? To all you static out there, having tantrums all the time, leaving invaluable comments on the videos. As you can see, I'm reading from historical primary sources. All the information in this book I'm reading from right now, right, is backed up by so many scholarly original sources. I mean, just go to the footnotes, Google this yourself. Again, A History of Slavery in Virginia. All right. Now we're gonna go back. It says, but even after the transition to slavery had been effected, and through the whole time that two institutions were coexistent, that is, for more than a century in Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Connecticut, and for long periods in other colonies, the reciprocal influence of the one on the other was marked. The general effect of this relation is to be seen in the gradual hardening of the conditions of servitude, hardening and mitigation of those of slavery, so that the form finally assumed by slavery was of a milder type than ancient, medieval, or even contemporary forms of that institution, while the line between servitude and slavery tended constantly towards obliteration.